So, Artunis, I'm I'm wondering what it was or what it is that attracts you to the SCA in general.
Well, as many people know, and I'm sure it's a story that's been told because people have told me that they heard about me. I showed up to the SCA not as somebody initially interested in joining, but as somebody who was writing an article for a local newspaper about an upcoming public demonstration, June Fair. Sorry, the Kids at Medieval Fair at the time. It was
Well,
public facing. Um, and honestly, I showed up to a fight practice one time because the Baron at the time, Connor, invited me to show up to take pictures for my article. I wanted to get pictures just as a few people fighting, a few people doing some arts and sciences and stuff. And it was literally just a matter of I wanted to get a couple extra quotes from people for the story. Um, so I started talking to people. And I was there the entire social event. So like the 2+ hours, 2 official hours and then some, just talking to people. And it was so interesting that I wanted to turn it into a series of articles because there was too much about the SCA to turn into one single article previewing the Kids at Medieval Fair. So I came back, and then I came back, and then I went to to people's houses to get demonstrations of their arts and sciences. I showed up to more fight practices. I focused on the arts and sciences. I focused on the pomp and circumstance of it all, the fighting, the siege weapons, the archery, the thrown weapons, and so on and so forth. Then I went to June Fair, and I was just going to do photos. And I already knew so many people here in Dragon's Lair. So I was able to get kind of a more behind-the-scenes look at things for my photo essay. And then the following Tuesday was Newcomers Night, and I was there not as a reporter, but as somebody who wanted to participate. And it was just the culture of everything, the welcoming, the friendliness, the fact that everybody cared so much about what they were doing.
So, can you put a better finger on, or a more specific finger on, what it was that made you want to come back?
So for me, personally, other than everybody's general passion,
And I should say, what made you want to come back as a participant rather than a journalist? Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Like I said, what I grew up loving, to the point where I got a tattoo from the BBC show of it to commemorate my love of it, is Robin Hood. So I came back because I was interested most in archery. But God, who doesn't grow up dreaming of sword and sorcery stuff? Who doesn't want to be a knight? Who doesn't want to get into sword fights and so on and so forth? So naturally, I was drawn to the fighting. And naturally, I wanted to try, heavy fighting, rapier fighting, freaking anything. Because I just wanted to hit people for fun,
Right.
I mean, we're all heavy fighters here, so I wanted to hit people. What can I say?
So, we have in the SCA, sadly, kind of a minority of our heavy fighters are female.
Mm-hmm.
What were the things that attracted you to heavy fighting in the first place?
Well, I've always been more of that kind of person, the kind who would do the rough and tumble, be the violent muscle of the group of my friends, for sure. I grew up, I was a competitive gymnast growing up, so I had that, athletic background and everything. And when I, was watching the fighting and I saw the camaraderie and I saw how much fun everybody had, the familial aspect of it, I hate to use this term, I really do, the brotherhood of it.
Fair enough.
And it's a good term, but it's not very inclusive as a woman.
It kind of seems that there needs to be a word for siblinghood.
Yeah, without it being as awkward as the word siblinghood.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
Right.
for sure. But the family aspect, everybody who I was watching fighting, the Legio, it's a family, and it's the kind of family that is not like a blood relative sort of thing, but it's a chosen family, and that's always had a lot of meaning to me. I love my blood relatives for sure. I love my blood relatives, but family is who you choose to spend your time with. And that's one thing that's always attracted me, I guess.
So, I hate to focus on the idea of minority of women in heavy fighting, but it's a big deal. What is it that I feel like our sport tends to? I mean, it'd be male dominated, but in a way tends to chase off a lot of female fighters. Can you give some reasons as to why it was that you were able to stay, or would encourage you to stay as a female fighter?
Absolutely. One thing, and I can only speak to my experience because everybody's experience is different, but I think I was really lucky that I discovered the SCA through Dragon's Lair. I'm not saying other places are bad, but just I know the people at Dragon's Lair, so I can speak to that particular experience. So many people in Dragon's Lair are so welcoming and not in a condescending, patronizing way. But it's very much everybody wants people to join. Everybody wants people to come back. And it can be a little overwhelming. I would say I personally have some social anxiety. I would say a lot of us do. So everybody wanting to come and help and bring you in is a little overwhelming. But I feel like because I had that easing in of being there as a reporter first, it made it a little bit easier for me because I had a chance to kind of break that ice a little bit. But I guess it was just a lot of so many people in that community clicked with me so quickly. You know, I had friends that felt like I'd been friends with them for a long time really quickly that kept me coming back. Now, I can see, I have known a lot of people who have come and been to 1 or 2 fight practices and we never saw them again. And I can see why. For one thing, heavy fighting is not easy, and it's not, well, it is painful. I mean, I personally cannot fight because my dominant arm is injured.
Now, is that because of heavy fighting, or?
Probably.
Okay.
To an extent, at the very least. I've been taking a lot of damage to my shoulder, and so I'm just kind of giving it a break for now. But it's definitely a hard sport, and it's one that has risks, which is part of the draw for those of us who like it, for sure. But I would say that one of the ways that Dragon's Lair, and again, I can only speak to my experience, but one of the ways that Dragon's Lair goes about it is it's usually very eases people into it so that people aren't, say, attacked and wailed on head on when they first start. People ease into it. You know, you start off gradually and you kind of amp it up a little bit. I wouldn't say that anyone necessarily have to, I don't know how to say this.
Kid gloves.
Yeah, kid gloves, thank you. Uses kid gloves is definitely a way to do it. I wouldn't say anyone, like, phones it in, I guess is the phrase that I was looking for. It's not that people aren't, working hard, but they're not going to necessarily beat the crap out of you when it's your first fight practice, when it's your second fight practice. For me, fighting doesn't come as naturally as other skills that I have, so I had to work a lot harder for it, which is good. It's something that I'm passionate about, so I'm happy to put in the work. But it took me a while to get to a point where I was able to throw blows at a level that could be acceptable in, say, like a kingdom tournament or something like that. And I don't always do that, and I'm getting to that point, and that's okay. But, when I'm starting off, when anyone starts off, they're not throwing shots as hard. They're not throwing with the best technique. And if you are constantly only fighting somebody who is only doing their 8th game, their top level, and they're not teaching you and they're just kind of wailing on you, it's kind of discouraging. And I can see a lot of people, if that's the situation that they are introduced to, maybe won't come back. They're getting hit really hard. They're not used to it yet. They're not landing any blows. They're not getting any help. I can see how that's pretty discouraging. To an extent, you got to work past the fact that your skill level is much lower than people. That's the same for everybody who's new. But when, say, I can imagine if you're the typical member of society, male, white, who joins, it's a lot easier to get through it because you can see everybody who looks like you, who is in your peer group. They're your fellows. When it's somebody who is a woman, I imagine people of color. I imagine people of non-heterosexual orientations or non-binary gender identities. It's hard when you don't see people who are like you, or at least presenting like you, because there's that level of camaraderie and familiarity that you can get just from seeing somebody who looks like you, who presents like you. I think when I started at the time, there was one other female fighter in Dragon's Lair. Typically, before COVID, I was probably the only consistent female fighter there every week, and in Dragon's Lair. And
still are, I think. I mean, not that we have consistency right now, but yeah.
But to me, at that point, I knew so many people in Dragon's Lair. I'm squire to Sir Andres. I have squire brothers. I have a couple squire sisters up in Canada. Unfortunately, I don't get to see them very often.
I know, right? So far away.
Right? But for me, because I had that emotional connection with a lot of people there at Dragon's Lair, it didn't feel like I was alone. But if I didn't have that, I can imagine that a lot of people might feel alone, and that's a really hard spot to be in.
So, if you were to give advice from your perspective, to be fair, from your perspective as a female fighter, if you were to give advice to anyone else as to how to welcome in other female fighters or anyone from any other kind of diverse background, what would that be?
Advice to people who are...
advice to people who are, say, of more experience level and trying to bring people into heavy fighting.
I would say one thing that makes it difficult to kind of put up with the fact that you're so new and such a lower level is how much you're inundated with everything. And I'm not saying that advice is bad, because obviously it's needed and welcome.
We do tend to over-explain. Yeah.
But I would say one thing that I notice anytime we have a new person at fight practice, and on the one hand it's fantastic, but on the other hand it makes me go, Anytime we have a new person, everybody is giving them advice. For days, it's just we get 10 seconds of fighting and then 10 minutes of explanation and advice and instruction. And that's great because people need to learn. But anytime there's a new person and that's all they're getting, they have very little of the actual enjoyable part and a lot of the, I have no idea what you're talking about, but you're talking about a lot of things. And it's overwhelming. One thing I like to tell new people, and I'm going to address the camera briefly because anybody who's interested in fighting, one thing I love to tell new people, take one or two things. Just one or two things every fight practice, because you can't take in more than that, and internalize that and work on that. And then eventually just add more things. But you got to start small. You got to start with one thing. And when it's somebody who doesn't see a lot of their peers, their obvious peers, can feel a little lonely and a little overwhelming.
Okay. So, if you were to give advice to, say, the rest of the fighters, including yourself,
Mm-hmm.
in the Barony, when it comes to newcomers, what am I understanding correctly that you would say to the experienced fighters? Limit it to maybe 3 things to practice, or maybe like one person giving input per practice. What is it you're saying for?
It's hard because there's no one right answer. It's going to be different for everyone. I would say if you have a new person showing up to fight practice, and this is going to be very, it doesn't necessarily work when it's newcomers night and there's a dozen new people.
Yeah, it's a different thing.
But when, say, one person just shows up, maybe talk to them one-on-one. Do not have them stand up in front of the crowd and introduce themselves and say, tell me your name and 3 interesting things about you. That's horrible. But maybe just have, say, one person talk to them and be like, hey, you're going to get a lot of advice. Before we get started, I just want you to know everybody here is very eager to get you to keep coming back. Everybody's going to want to give you advice and help you and try and make it so that it's better for you. But you have to know it all comes from a good place. And everybody is just excited to have you here. But don't let it overwhelm you. And if you and I feel like it's very important to tell people who are, maybe as they're getting their loner gear on, as they're getting their armor on, so that it's before everybody inundates them with all of this advice. Just let them know they absolutely have the right to say, I can't handle any more advice right now. Because the whole idea is to just try it out and let them learn to love it. And then they can learn the skills and the techniques and the forms and everything like that. But you gotta have the passion first, because otherwise you're never gonna put in the work. And if you're constantly being inundated with all of this unsolicited advice from all of these people, and to use a modern term, all of the mansplaining can be very overwhelming and off-putting. And again, that's not to say advice is bad. But for me, at least, I have a very high ability to say, I'm just going to ignore everything you just said to me because I can't handle that right now. But not everybody has that. And we don't want to discourage people from coming back. So if they feel overwhelmed, they may never come back. And we don't want that.
So then, I think this is the last question I have for you. You, in the SCA, have a number of different backgrounds. You're not only heavy, but you're also archery and combat archery. And you do some arts and sciences as well, correct?
I've dipped my toes in a little bit.
Okay, fair enough. So would you say that the advice that you're giving goes to all of those disciplines, or would you say that they're more specific to heavy fighting?
I would say for everything.
Okay.
And I say that having served my 2-year term as Chief Archer of Dragon Slayer.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so I was Chief Archer for 2 years, and naturally we had a lot of people come in as never before fighting. And we have a lot of great archers in Dragon Slayer. We've got a few Arcos, and people who aren't Arcos, but are fantastic archers.
I mean, some of the highest in the known SCA world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Some of the highest ranked archers in the entire known world, especially in Ontario, are in Dragon Slayer. It's fantastic. But it also means that everybody has advice, and everybody wants to help new people, and everybody wants to teach and learn so that people can get good and get good fast, so that they are encouraged to come back. And as somebody who's only been playing for a few years at this point, I remember what it's like to be greeted with all of that, and it's overwhelming. And I mean, my lifelong adoration of freaking Robin Hood made it so that I ignored all of that and I was cool with it. But when I was Chief Archer and I was greeting the new people on the archery range for the first time, I didn't talk about how to make their aim perfect. I didn't talk about how to hit the gold every single time. I told them, hey, don't worry about where you're hitting. What we need to do is try to aim for consistency. Work on basic form. And also just remember it's a skill. It's a skill that's gonna take time to develop. And just focus on one or two things. One or two things every practice. And go from there. It's gonna come with time. It's gonna get there. But I would say it's a pretty universal thing. You know, there's a lot of experts throughout the known world. There's a lot of experts in Ontier and a lot of experts in Dragon's Lair. Everybody's got advice, and it's great. It's fantastic because you can always find somebody who can teach you and help you learn new things. But everybody learns at their own pace, and we need to be able to respect that and not overwhelm people so that people are willing and eager to come back and learn.
Cool. Thank you very much.